Hello and welcome to the Lewis Carroll Society of North America's 2023 Summer School. That's right, school is in session. If you're wondering who these pupils are on either side of me, I took that illustration of the jury box from Alice's Adventures in Wonderland from Alexander Dodon's 2000 version. It's a Russian edition, so look that up if you want to see more of his wonderful illustrations. Now, today's tortoise who taught us will be Dr. Franziska Kohlt, and her presentation is called Alice in Science and Medicine in the Victorian Age and Beyond. Now, if you're watching this on our YouTube channel, today's presentation is about science and medicine, but we have something for everybody, so please poke around. We have heard from musicians, actors, marionettists, authors, philosophers, poets, sculptors, you name it, you will find something of interest for you on this channel. My name is Heather, and I get to host these events. I'm also the chairwoman of the Senior Common Room curators, the people who bring you these events almost every month. Used to be monthly, now it's a little less often. Without further ado, let's get to our speaker, Dr. Franziska Kohlt. She is a research fellow in history and philosophy of science at the University of Leeds. She is also the inaugural Carrollian Fellow here at USC, at the University of Southern California in Los Angeles, which is very exciting for me because that means I get to see her in person sometimes. We're in the same time zone. She wrote her PhD thesis at the University of Oxford, investigating the historical intersections of the history of psychology and psychiatry and the works of Victorian writers of fantastic literature. And guess what? That's what she's going to talk about today. Welcome, Dr. Franziska Kohlt. Hi, Fran.
Hello, it's really nice to see you. Hope everybody can see everything. So I would like to start this talk with this slide. And I'll give you a couple of seconds to have a look at it and to take it in, because I'm not going to tell you what it is just now. I'll just let you see if you can spot something. Those are the sort of things that work well when you can see an audience's live reaction, which I unfortunately can't. So I'm just going to assume that the penny will drop at some point, because in the left column, you'll almost certainly recognize some book titles. They include titles such as Alice in Wonderland. If you don't recognize them, you're probably in the wrong talk. The football is probably still on and you can still leave. But if you do recognize them, in the next column, you'll hopefully also recognize at least one name, the one just above the finger, and that is the name of A.M. Turing, which stands for Alan Matheson Turing, or Alan Turing for short. So first of all, this warrants a little bit of an explanation. What is this? What does it mean? And why am I starting today's talk with this slide? So what this is, it's the school record, the library record, in fact, of Alan Turing's boarding school, Sherborne School, and evidence that Alan Turing borrowed not one, but in fact 3 of Lewis Carroll's books from his school library, and in fact more than once. Now, Alan Turing, who I hope all of you will know, if you're in the UK, from the brand new £50 note, or if you're from anywhere else, from The Imitation Game, or in fact as a historical figure, Turing was a mathematician, computer scientist, and a Bletchley Park code breaker, and as many of you will probably know, not the only one with a Lewis Carroll connection. Why I picked out Alan Turing to start this conversation today about Alice and science is that it is often surprising, or at least amazing, when I show people this slide, because to a lot of audiences, Alan Turing and Alice in Wonderland occupy, or seem to occupy, 2 entirely different dimensions of public life, thought, history and culture. Alan Turing, for many, is the epitome of science, of useful knowledge. He's a war hero, a really important historical figure. A lot of people look up to him. Alice in Wonderland is, well, you know, children's book, fantasy, a thing those sort of people study who do Mickey Mouse degrees at universities, or at least so the public story very often goes. And I know today I'm talking to an audience to whom it might seem slightly less surprising that a mathematician read the work of another mathematician, but perhaps even you will find some reasons that drew Turing and Carroll together more surprising, such as the history of mind, the sciences of the mind, the science of the persistence of the soul after death, and much more. And today's talk will concern itself with some of those interesting and perhaps surprising confluences of science and literature, and the perhaps surprising places in which we encounter them in history, but also in the present, and in the life and work of Lewis Carroll and his impact on scientific thought in his time, but also in the long run, including in such fields as ecology or medicine, or even psychiatry, and as we've just seen, computing. And this talk will disentangle a little bit what Alice does in these places, what Alice can make possible within them. So let's get started. I chose for the title for this lecture, the title of my forthcoming book, Alice Through the Wonderglass. And this is not purely for PR purposes, but also for a host of other reasons, which I hope will become evident. It might first of all remind us of Through the Looking Glass. And this might seem a slightly counterintuitive place to start exploration of Alice with a second published title of the book, but perhaps that's exactly what I need to do in order for all of the things that we're trying to discuss today to make sense. Now, the title of Through the Looking Glass, which is what we'll start with, was the result of Alexander Macmillan, in fact, advising his author, Lewis Carroll, to slightly change the title of his proposed book, as the word through instead of behind the looking glass was, as Macmillan asserted, exactly what Lewis Carroll needed in his title. He says, that's just the word you're looking for. Oh, hang on, here we go. So, through is just the word, you'll never beat it. So he's fairly adamant about it. Now, why is this significant? The story of Alice in Wonderland and how it was published is very often sort of boiled down to somewhat inaccurately, and it's presented as a book written in a sort of stream of consciousness. The surrealists even believed that, well, some of the surrealists believed that it was even written as an example of automatic writing. And while this may apply to the moment that the story was first told on this Oxford River journey that we all know about, this journey on which it was told and conceived, it didn't exactly apply to the same degree to the text of Alice's Adventures in Wonderland, and in that regard, also to Through the Looking Glass, as published by Macmillan, which was the result of a really rather laborious process. As a first-time author, Carroll was working with a publisher, Macmillan, who was concerned about their sales, about his image, what his brand represented, and the manuscript of Through the Alice's Adventures Underground was revised into Wonderland. It was a manuscript read, reread, evaluated, opined upon by various different people in this process. It was illustrated, re-illustrated, and managed in its presentation, down to the color of the cloth in which the text was eventually wrapped in. So every step of this process was taken care of and demonstrated in every single detail an acute awareness of the Victorian publishing market and its expectations, and where in it the authors and the publishers' interests sat, how it reflected their moral convictions, and how these moral convictions were shaped by different but similar upbringings of Lewis Carroll and of Alexander Macmillan, a process in which mathematics, religion, and science played a significant role, and where these coincided. Now, Alice was released into a book market at a time when children's literature was perhaps, against popular belief, a flourishing genre. And it included not merely boring moralistic stories, as it's often narrated, but in fact fairy tales, adventure tales, tales of mythology and folklore, but above all, the absolute bestseller genre of the day, which I'll talk about in a second. But I thought it's just instructive to actually have a look at what the Victorian publishing market for children looked like. So this is from the 1850s, a sort of recommendation chart for parents, what sort of books they might want to buy for their children in the 1850s. So that's before Alice came out. So we can see here the Pilgrim's Progress and tales we perhaps recognize, but also Gulliver's Travels, Aesop's Fables, Robinson Crusoe, Arabian Nights. If we sort of hop to the second slide, Danish fairy tales and legends. And what do we see on the right-hand side here? The Saturday magazine, Leisure Hour. So those were also magazines, as you can see in the subtitle of family reading. So children's stories were also serialized. They came out in a variety of genres. So there was really no dearth of children's literature at the time. But the absolute bestseller genre of the day, and those also appeared in serialized natures in magazines like the Saturday Magazine or Leisure Hour, were called the so-called natural histories. And perhaps surprisingly, they actually united all of these genres, adventure stories, fairy stories, and natural science in one genre. Don't believe me? Here we go. So titles such as these. So we've got here a Dictionary of Natural History, perhaps not that one, but Half Hours in Field and Forest, Through Magic Glasses, Insect Abroad. Such titles as these give us a sense that these were not only books that in a time of significantly shifting thought on science and religion, tried through the apparently neutral ground of nature and natural history, tried to introduce children to the wondrous world outside their front door, in forests, fields, the seaside, but also as seen through magic glasses, in the heavens, in space, through telescopes, or in tiny, minute detail in a drop of water. Now, Carroll was no stranger to the authors of such literature, and as you can see, they evoke the sense of wonder in learning about nature. And it's almost like it's an exciting adventure to dive into these worlds to which we don't usually pay a lot of attention. And when we study Carroll's library, we can see that he owned many of these books, especially John George Wood's best-selling Common Objects of the Seashore and Insects at Home, which is the counterpart to Insects Abroad, which we can see on the present slide. And he also owned books from slightly earlier authors who remained bestsellers throughout the century, such as Jane Marseille and Anna Barbauld, authors respectively of Conversations on Chemistry and the surprisingly popular 4th century Evenings at Home. And we can spot certain special areas of interest among the books that Carroll owned as well, among them especially microscopy and insects, and especially the former as applied to the study of the latter. And we also know that Carroll was no stranger, as we can see from this diary note, to the practical processes that were associated with these books. In this diary note, we can read Carroll's first recorded attempt at microscopy. His uncle Skeffington, who sounds like the cool uncle who always had all of the latest gadgets, has just got a number of new oddities, including a telescope and a beautiful little pocket instrument for measuring distances, a refrigerator, and all sorts of other things. And what they did was they had an observation of the moon and Jupiter last night and afterwards of live animalcules in his large microscope. And this is a most interesting sight, as the creatures are most conveniently transparent, and you can see all the organs jumping about like a complicated piece of machinery, and even the circulation of the blood. Everything goes at railway speed, so I suppose they must be some of these insects who only live a day or two and try to make the most of it. Now, this is a wonderful little insight into what Carroll believed the microscope could do. It could see through things and reveal inside of something we can usually not see, something that is hidden below the surface of the visible, the secret but true workings of it in its inside. So the pursuit of things like microscopy and entomology in Carroll's day and age signified a process of seeing through, and we remember Macmillan's emphasis on that word, of seeing through things and discovering within them their inner and true workings. Something that may have deceived us with what it seemed on the outside is suddenly by these magic glasses unmasked, and we see it for what it really was. And this process, in fact, has its own name, and we know it from another usage which survives into the English language in the present day. And this word is diagnosis, often used in a medical setting. But really what this word means is it describes the process of seeing through, but because the Greek language is fantastic, we not only see through, but through the process of seeing, come to know better whatever we see through. And if you're familiar with what you do at the doctor's, you have a blood sample taken, your doctor puts a blood drop under the microscope and sees through it. And by seeing through that microscope, knows whether something is really working as it should or not. And the counterpart to this term, and I'm just laying this out, so everything else that we'll talk about in a second will make way more sense. The counterpart to this term in the Greek language is the word to make visible, or fantasy, phantazai, to make visible, to illuminate. And that will make the presence of magic glasses in Carroll's writing, in Victorian science and culture, and its fantastic use in fantasy literature and the Victorian children's books of this day make a lot more sense if we remind ourselves of the meaning of these words throughout. These children's books of Victorian days were not only meant to be educational, but they're also entertaining as well as educational, like the purpose those magic glasses had in Victorian society. And the Victorians called them, for a reason, philosophical toys. So that included magic lanterns, thaumatropes, zoetropes, all of those fantastic optical devices, like this is a zoetrope, all of those fantastical devices that blurred the line between the visible, the invisible, that were not just entertaining, but also edifying, testing our senses, expanding them, and the way in which we could come to know through them, and perhaps discover new ways in which we could know through their playful way of expanding our range of vision and our range of knowledge. And the one that you can see right here is the so-called phantasmagoria, which is of course also the title of one of Carroll's poems, where he works with this particular technology, but more on that in a second. So Alice is of course all about seeing through the apparent nature of things. Oh yeah, a few more pictures of magic lanterns. And here's my slide to part two. So Alice is all about seeing through the apparent nature of things. And the example I'm going to choose to talk yourself through how it was Victorian science and Lewis Carroll's understanding of it and how he acquired it that shaped the way he wrote his fiction. And I'll illustrate how Carroll harnessed and shared a shared understanding of a particular science of his time and its medical and social function at the time by imitating it in writing, but applying it in an analogous way, but also playing with its meanings and inverting them, which made it so attractive, I would argue, in his writing. Now, we all sort of know what happens at the Mad Tea Party, but just in case you've forgotten, Alice joins the Mad Tea Party after being informed by the Cheshire Cat that everybody in Wonderland, they are all mad, herself and the cat included, upon which Alice informs us that she does not wish to go among mad people, but inevitably does so anyway, and after much frustration experienced at said Mad Tea Party, leaves with the immortal line that this was in fact the stupidest tea party she had ever seen. Now, tea parties, and apologies for those of you who have already heard me talk about this before and who've heard this bit before, but tea parties were in fact a really common feature of Victorian lunatic asylums. Here is an account for one of them, which will hopefully make you marvel and entertain also. So here's an account of a so-called tea party at the Retreat, which was one of the biggest asylums in Victorian England, in the city of York. This account comes from Samuel Tuke, who was the superintendent for a while, and also this is a book that was in the possession of Lewis Carroll. Now, let me read you how this tea party went. The female superintendent occasionally gives an invitation to the patients to a tea party. All who attend dress in their best clothes and vie each other in all the politeness and propriety. The best fare is provided, and the visitors are treated with all the attention of strangers, and the evening generally passes in the greatest harmony and enjoyment. It rarely happens that any unpleasant circumstance occurs. The patients control in a wonderful degree their different propensities, and the scene is at once curious and affectingly gratifying. Now, as you'll have noticed, tea parties, and this is if you sort of picture this whole scene, you may have stumbled over the word visitors. So those were tea parties introduced as a sort of new therapeutic measure at lunatic asylums, so as a social moment in the therapy of the inmates of these asylums. But as you can see from the word visitors, people could in fact purchase tickets and go and attend these tea parties and other functions at the asylums. Now, why would this have happened? This is actually quite significant, because such visits, as well as an engagement with the depictions and reports of such functions at lunatic asylums, which were prolific at in the Victorian gossip press, and really quite famous authors such as Charles Dickens wrote about attending, for instance, asylum balls. They were absolutely prolific in Victorian papers, and you'd read about them quite a lot. And the point of them was that you, as an upstanding citizen, could go to these working class asylums, which were full of working class people, look at it and realize, oh my gosh, the people behind these walls, they're all lunatics. This is what lunacy looks like. And if you go back, the whole scene is at once curious and affectingly gratifying. It was a affecting experience, but also gratifying, because you were not one of them. And if you think about the Mad Tea Party scene a little bit more, this is of course the role that gets inverted. All of these people who behave quite virtuous are cast in the role of the lunatics who cannot leave, and Alice is in fact the one that does leave, which shows us that she's the one who is not actually mad. But let's return to the subject at hand. Carroll was introduced to the subject of Victorian psychiatry, as well as to microscopy and photography, by the same person. And that was his uncle Skeffington, who I've already mentioned. Robert Wilfred Skeffington Lutwidge was a man who was a lunacy commissioner, a job title that needs a little bit of explanation. This is a position newly created by the English government in the early 19th century, of people who would supervise the reform of Victorian lunatic asylums that were in fact the most sort of present form of hospitals, in public hospitals in the Victorian age, in which he would be in charge of supervising the reform of these working class lunatic asylums. But it was also through Skeffington, remember the cool uncle who was into all the gadgets? He was also introduced to Hugh Diamond, another superintendent of a lunatic asylum, but someone who's also often mentioned as the father figure of the modern technology of photography, who advanced this technology mostly, and this might be surprising for us, in his psychiatric profession. Now, kindly enough, Hugh Diamond does the work of explaining to us why photography became so prolific in the psychiatric setting in a speech that he gave to the Royal Society. He says of photography and what he believed it could be capable of was that the photographer needs no aid from any language of his own, but prefers to listen with a picture in front of him to the silent and telling language of nature. He secures with unerring accuracy the external phenomena of each passion as the really certain indication of internal derangement, and it exhibits to the eye the well-known sympathy that exists between the diseased brain and the organs and features of the body. So, outlining his understanding of how photography worked, Diamond stated, in fact, that what the photo camera did was analogous exactly to the microscope. It was a diagnostic device. It could look through the face of the patient and reveal to us in a photograph the inner working, the decisive proof of whether or not a person was in fact mad. And this is where we realize that this is exactly the understanding of photography that Carroll adopts in his early satirical writing, for instance, in Hiawatha's Photographing. This is a poem, my favorite Lewis Carroll poem, in which a photographer, probably with slightly autobiographic connotations, is sent to photograph an upper middle class family who all pose in striking poses of virtue, imitating various important historical figures, embodying various virtuous philosophies. But in every single photo of every family member that gets taken, the photograph fails completely because this pose could not be kept up, because it was all pretense. And what the camera actually does, it diagnoses for us the real face of these people. As the final stanza tells us, he did at last obtain a picture where the faces all succeeded, each came out a perfect likeness. Then they joined and all abused it, unrestrainedly abused it as the worst and ugliest pictures that they could have possibly dreamt of, giving one such strange expressions, sullen, stupid, pert expressions. Really, anyone would take us, anyone who does not know us, for the most unpleasant people. Hiawatha seemed to think so, seemed to think it not unlikely. All together rang their voices, angry, loud, discordant voices, as of dogs that howl in concert, as of cats that wail in chorus. So really what the camera does here, it reveals to us that these people are actually, despite all of their pretenses, mad. And what the camera does, it's the camera that unmasks this. But what Carroll, as the author, does, he imitates exactly through his fiction this function the camera was scientifically believed to hold. And this is how a really great example of how Carroll imitates this optical culture, optical beliefs, optical science in his writing, and how they directly informed him through his extensive reading of such sciences. So was Alice in this context? Could Alice be really just nonsense? Or might its interplay with Victorian science have enabled it to perform a slightly more incisive diagnostic scientific function, one might say, in society? Might there even be lesson in it, some teaching, something pedagogical, or might it even have something vaguely to do with scientific subjects or their social ramifications? As Carroll would specify himself in his Easter greeting, he in fact envisaged Alice as healthy amusement, which is a striking term in this context. But it also had a very specific meaning to the Charles Lutwidge Dodson, who had grown up in a Christian household with Christian natural history literature, and the man who would choose to teach mathematics as his profession because he considered it his word for God. And these were books, the books that he read as a child were books that led a child through the process of seeing through, but also to seeing truth, and gaining from this truth they have unmasked moral guidance for life. And these books, very much like Lewis Carroll's own books, were teaching the child, well, making the child learn how to unmask that untruth in their own lives. Because that, after all, was what he believed was the purpose of writing a funny book, which even Carroll assumed his readers would be surprised to hear. Because if you wanted to make a really serious point, why would you write a really funny book? But actually, that is exactly the function of humor. And as I personally believe, you haven't lived until you've had a German explain the meaning of humor to you with a spreadsheet. Here we go. A spreadsheet that explains humor. Now, the function of humor, and I teach this to my students, has a motif, an aim, a province, certain methods, and an audience. And as you can see in the left-hand column, I love a good spreadsheet, there's different types of humor, and Carroll was a master of very many of them. Now, if we start off with the most basic, humor, its motif or aim is discovery. Its province, human nature, its method and means, observation, and its audience, the sympathetic. So when you make a joke and you're hoping other people will laugh about it because they might feel the same about that thing you just made a joke at. Now, satire changes the meaning a little bit because its aim is amendment. So we're talking about a transformation here, about learning something, and its province are morals and manners. Its methods and means were accentuation. So if you want to criticize a particular immorality or ill manners, you would accentuate them by making them grotesque, by blowing them up. And its audience, and this is particularly important, are the self-satisfied. Now, we often talk about dual audiences of Alice in Wonderland, but of course it does both. And if we draw attention to the function of satire and humor as something that wants to make us reflect on certain things, but also undergo certain changes, this might change a little bit how we look at Alice in Wonderland and also the texts it makes jokes about. So diagnosing behind the pretension of virtue, as we've just seen in Hiawatha's photographing, a real immorality can also apply to ourselves. We might also sheepishly laugh because we feel caught out. So what Carroll does is he leads us through a process of reflection, maybe upon the immorality of our society, but also something in ourselves. In this process, we could know ourselves and find a more virtuous way forward. And that was really the point of his books. And if we draw ourselves back to the title, Through the Looking Glass, the stakes could really not be higher for a clergyman if we consider what going through mirrors meant in the Bible. Because in the Bible, these moments usually mark the moment where we gain full knowledge, the passing through the mirror from life to the afterlife and its union with God and full knowledge. But we also, at this point, become ourselves fully known, fully unmasked, all pretenses stripped away. So the passage through a magic glass was really quite a potent way of phrasing a journey or realizing a journey to self-recognition and moral transformation. And that neatly brings us back to Through the Looking Glass and Carroll's other subject of interest I highlighted earlier, and that is the province of insects. You might once again now reasonably ask, what have insects got to do with anything I've just said? Well, insects, if we draw ourselves back to the Victorian publishing context in which Alice in Wonderland and Through the Looking Glass appeared, were considered a prime subject for children through which to A, study nature, and B, teach how we might gain from it knowledge about ourselves, about nature, and from that knowledge extract how we should run society. Now, it's absolutely no coincidence that the language in which we still talk about insects, about insect colonies, and colonies, about queen bees, about worker bees, is extremely anthropomorphic and very reminiscent of 19th century structures of labor, of society, because from it, we were meant to learn lessons from nature of what sort of systems of running our world are the most natural, because nature itself suggests them to us. So this is not entirely value-free literature, and we will definitely come to that in just one second. But that insect encounters were meant to be morally improving became so much of a cliche that there were also an enormous amount of parodies of this genre. And because there was such an enormous number of these books, it was really quite unsurprising that Lewis Carroll, the hobby entomologist, also owned quite a lot of them. So this is one of them on the left-hand side, Bernard's Happy Thoughts, which is a book of one of those pretentious upper middle class families of Hiawatha's photographing, constantly plagued by insects that reveal their actual moral failings. This is Lewis Carroll's own copy, which is sitting in the Cassidy collections in the University of Southern California, which I had the privilege to visit earlier this year, and I'll come back to in just a bit. Thanks to the Carrollian Fellowship, and if the Cassidys or any of the librarians are there, thank you so much. I've had a great time, and it's really enriched my research in ways that you'll hopefully see very shortly. Because all of these books really show us that there's so much more to the insects in Through the Looking Glass and in Alice's Adventures than we see on the surface. Now, among those books were also The Population of an Old Pear Tree and very many others. So this is a fairy tale that visits insect societies that are very, very anthropomorphic. But as you can see, there's always a human in the background. So they all teach us a lesson about ourselves, really, that's enacted in those insects. Now, insect encounters were really the currency in natural history literature to teach children moral lessons. They, if they were incorporated into other sorts of fictions, the insect encounter was usually the thing that delivered the teachable moment, as we would now call it. But what children should be taught, how and why, was an extremely contested field at the time. And we really get a whiff of that the moment that Carroll boldly steps into this really contested field of childhood education and positions himself within it, which he does quite boldly and through the looking glass, even more so than in Alice's Adventures in Wonderland, because he's now got a literary success under his belt and he can be a little bit more outspoken. So at first, when we enter through the looking glass, we think it might just be a story about a land that looks a little bit like a chessboard, and we could probably be forgiven to think that. So Alice enters something that's the most curious country. There were a number of tiny little brooks running straight across it from side to side, and the ground between them was divided up into squares by a number of little green hedges that reached from brook to brook. I declare it's marked out just like a large chessboard, Alice said at last. But the moment we carry on, it all seems to become a little bit more about education than we perhaps might remember. So let's reread how this goes on. Of course, the first thing to do was to make a grand survey of the country she was going to travel through. It's something very like learning geography, thought Alice, as she stood on tiptoe in hopes of being able to see a little further. Here comes Alice, the Victorian explorer. Principal rivers. There are none. Principal mountains. I'm on the only one, but I don't think it's got a name. Principal towns. Why? What are those creatures making honey down there? They can't be bees. Nobody ever saw bees a mile off, you know. And for some time she stood silent, watching one of them that was bustling about among the flowers, poking its proboscis into them, just as if it was a regular bee, thought Alice. Now that sounds really a lot more educational. We've got geography here, we've got mapping and mapping out the various elements of geography on a map, surveying. And why are we suddenly talking about the proboscis of bees that actually turn out to be elephants? I set myself a challenge to include elephants in this today because it's National Elephant Day, but it is also a very relevant joke. So why would Carroll start the book off with the jokes on bees and elephants? This was, in fact, if you pick off any of those books that Lewis Carroll had on on the subject of natural history, insects, or anything relating to that, the most funny joke that was included somewhere in the first chapter in almost all of them. Lewis Carroll had a very specific preference among these books, not the sort of books that would lecture children with lists of things to learn by heart and barrages of Latin words, which might not come as a big surprise to us. But there was a real educational movement that wanted children to use everyday language to learn about nature. And in everyday language, you would use different words for the facial appendages of humans, of elephants, of bees, but the Latin name for all of them is in fact proboscis. And that Lewis Carroll thought was exactly as silly as all of the other Victorian writers that he liked, that continuously in all of their works included in the very first pages jokes about the big strange words, and Carroll very firmly positions himself on this side of the debate on Victorian education. We take a quote here from J.G. Woods' Insects at Home, which I've already introduced. There's scarcely a branch of science, however interesting it may be, which does not at first repel the intending student by an array of strange words with which the treasures of knowledge are surrounded. Another author that Lewis Carroll was a big fan of was Charles Kingsley, who starts his fairy tale with a really similar joke. Tom found himself swimming in the stream, being about 4 inches, or that I may be accurate, 3.87902 inches long, and having around the parotid region of his fauces a set of external gills. I hope you understand all the big words. So those are the sort of people, it's like, this is not, you can't educate children like this. Speak plain language, the plain language of God's creation, to reveal and not obfuscate the truths hidden within it, the treasures of knowledge that are surrounded and hidden by these words. And Carroll makes that joke to very firmly position himself on that side, because if you use those words, you're not even going to learn anything. You really start confusing bees and elephants. It's not going to teach you anything. So we can fully expect that Carroll tells us a story about how to explore nature as if through one of these magic glasses, in the way that he found appropriate and to the ends that he found appropriate. So if you remember what I said about Alice being very conscious, Carroll being very conscious of the publishing environment at the start, you'll notice now how Through the Looking Glass becomes bolder in positioning itself within it. So Alice's first insect encounter happens in a railway carriage. And when a little voice reveals itself as an insect, and she reveals in turn to the insect that she really doesn't, as she says, rejoice in insects because they sting. A view which we can perhaps all sympathize with, but nonetheless an anthropocentric one that Carroll may or may not really agree with. So this is something where we start off this story. Now, in the manner of these Victorian natural science books he loved, Carroll magnifies the insects as if Alice was really going through a microscope. We even observe a change in font size, and the gnat that is previously invisible in just a little voice now becomes the same font size. It gets elevated to the same level of communication as Alice, and even is now the size of a chicken, as we later learn. So Looking Glass imitates exactly the anticipated effect of such encounters in the natural histories Lewis Carroll preferred in this very rich market. In Woods's Insects at Home, we would read about the benefit of seeing good in everything, but especially in the most maligned of animated beings. Among those, Wood lists that the creatures we should pay special attention to, those maligned creatures who, quote, bite and sting. Through studying them in their natural habitat, Wood then adds, the study would render such creatures we might previously be afraid of, such as, and that's the example he mentions, a gnat, would make them into our little friends. And that's exactly what we see happening in the story. We see this shift in thinking about insects through studying them in their habitat illustrated in the way the plot of Through the Looking Glass carries on, as the gnat introduces Alice in the typical encyclopedic fashion of these books, when Alice encounters one looking glass insect after the other. So we see here the rocking horsefly and the snapdragon fly are introduced to Alice, who becomes increasingly curious about them. And only just having actually been really, really afraid of insects, and because they might sting, and she really doesn't want to engage with them, she now suddenly becomes really curious and even thoughtful, which we see in the episode of The Bread and Butterfly, in which this first encounter culminates. So let's pay a little bit of attention to that. Crawling at your feet, said the gnat, and Alice drew her feet back in some alarm, you may observe a bread and butterfly. Its wings are thin slices of bread and butter, its body is a crust, and its head a lump of sugar. Now what does it live on? Weak tea with cream in it. A new difficulty came into Alice's head. Well, supposing it couldn't find any, she suggested. Well, then it would die, of course. But that must happen very often, Alice remarked thoughtfully. It always happens, said the gnat. And after this, Alice was silent for a minute or two, pondering. So this is actually already a really remarkable transformation. Alice was just a few pages ago really afraid of insects. Suddenly she becomes really curious, and she finds it quite pleasant to converse with a gnat. She wants to learn more about these insects, and by the time they reach the last one of them, she's actually really worried about them. She's pondering, like whatever's happening with her, she becomes thoughtful, she's pondering, and not immediately goes like, oh no, hate insects, they sting, really don't like them, really do not rejoice in them. So this is quite remarkable, and I just want to take a step back from this, because why are we writing about insects in this way in the 19th century, in the 1870s when this book comes out? In this day and age, the threat to insects' lives, as here to the bread and butterfly, was extremely real. As the Victorian landscape that Lewis Carroll would have had all around him in Oxfordshire would have changed with the progress of industrialization and the resulting changes in agriculture. And so the British landscape was in that time really quite significantly reshaped by deforestation and changes to the countryside by the reforms to the Enclosures of Land Act. Now, this is something that came into force in Tudor England, so really a long time ago, but was made sort of industrially more efficient in the 19th century, in which the newly deforested landscape was cut up into these very real live chessboard fields in order to be more mathematical, to be more efficient about the crop grown in them. So this is also how the British countryside gains quite a lot of its typical features, the sort of hedges and brooks and fences and enclosed forests and residue wild spaces centering around a village to which the enclosure belongs, as some of you who might have perhaps flown into Oxford will have seen from above. So this was, of course, progress, scientific progress, but not only a positive change. It was also perceived as a threat to nature. And this is something especially observed by amateur entomologists at the time. So among the copious amount of books and periodicals that Carroll owned, we find not just the sort of children's literature that inspired some of these insects in Wonderland and the way they are portrayed, but also some of these amateur entomological magazines. And so within them, we find a copy of the Entomologist, one of those journals, a periodical that in fact, and in that exact copy, contains one of the first description of the impact of industrialization on moth populations, and perhaps the most famous example that we're still teaching in school that teaches us how the peppered moth changed through the industrialization, which was in fact observed in the early 1860s in one of those amateur journals for the very first time. This is obviously very, very early on. And in these first descriptions of the impact on the industrialization on moth populations, this is perceived as a disappearance rather than a mutation of the white peppered moth in favor of a black phenotype, which obviously was the one that could camouflage better on the blackened buildings and blackened trees, blackened by the smoke of the industrialization, a phenomenon which we now describe as industrial melanism. But this is something that hugely disturbed some Victorian minds, as they understood it for the first time as an example of anthropogenic extinction caused by human philosophies and human actions. And in the face of a scientific culture that really quite widely understood insects not as animals, but as automata, as phrased here by T.H. Huxley, who also had the nickname Darwin's bulldog, who believed animals could be separated into higher and lower animals, insect being among the lower animals that had no reason, no soul, and therefore effectively functioned like machines. And here's where Lewis Carroll, the anti-vivisectionist, had originally planned to make a point that was brought forward so ardently by many of the natural histories he so loved, that we must care, especially about the creatures considered lower. A distinction that he warns us, in fact, is a fallacy in his essay entitled Some Popular Fallacies About Vivisection, in which he explains to us that such distinctions about lower and higher species among humans and animals are in fact merely rhetorically constructed and applied to animal and human alike whenever a purpose is served by it. And he applies the reductio ad absurdum fallacy to this sort of argument, claiming that, and when that day shall come, that day when we are suddenly not on the right side of that distinction anymore, oh, my brother man, who claim for yourself and for me so proud an ancestry, tracing our pedigree through the anthropomorphoid ape, up to the primeval zoophyte. What potent spell have you in store to win exemption from the common doom? So really, he tries to make us rethink how we classify animals, how we behave towards them, and why. And perhaps we should follow a different way of studying nature, a different way of scientifically educating our children that makes us think differently about nature than this. And he singles out, especially as creatures that might be thus treated in the animal kingdom, the hapless moth and the insects that might be crushed underfoot. So the narrative climate of Alice's transformational encounters with insects is reached out of all chapters in Through the Looking Glass, or actually not really in Through the Looking Glass, through the chapter A Wasp in a Wig. The chapter in which Alice encounters a terribly rude wasp, ailing, however, and at the end of its life. And this same girl who was once really afraid of insects because they sting, who has, however, in the meantime, learned her lesson by listening to insects, by studying them in their habitat, by honoring especially the ones that are most despised, offers the wasp, which is like the epitome of the insect that stings. If I asked you if you could name me an insect that stings, I think most of you would say wasp first. But that is the insect she now, without any hesitation, offers her help and leaves eventually feeling happy that she could make the poor old creature comfortable. Her entire language has completely changed from the start of the chapter. From the start of the book, she hopes she can be of use to this insect, help him. She asks repeatedly, "Can I do anything for you?" Even when the wasp is really rude to her, she thinks compassionately, perhaps it's only the pain that makes him so cross. And she looks pityingly at him. So she delays her entire journey and in fact then feels really gratified by it. Alice tripped down the hill again, quite pleased that she had gone back and given a few minutes to making the old poor creature comfortable. Now, while some doubt the authenticity of the wasp chapter, which is an argument we can perhaps have another day, it is really quite striking that it is totally not out of character for Carroll to write this, because Carroll had in fact rehearsed that exact same plot already in his 1867 story Bruno's Revenge, the forerunner of his later Sylvie and Bruno novels. In these, Sylvie is the one who aids a struggling beetle when it has fallen and rolled over on its back. But really the first couple of pages in the story are just a reflection of Carroll, very much with the voice of Carroll, the anti-vivisectionist, tells us his own musings. He takes the position of the beetle and sort of along in a reflection monologue, which ends with the line, "If I were a beetle and had rolled over on my back, I should always be glad to be helped up again." So this is exactly the same sort of plot that he models in Sylvie, that he then recaptures in The Wasp and the Wig. And even though the chapter is missing, this communication with Tenniel survives, in which allegedly Tenniel's the one that makes him withdraw the chapter. And it is kind of the logical conclusion of this story arc that is so present in all of these stories that Carroll so loved, that put forward a different way of studying nature and gaining lessons from this study for how we should behave personally after we've learned scientific facts, and how we should perhaps think about nature and run society on this basis. But it all comes full circle, really, when we consider that this story, Bruno's Revenge, was published by one of Carroll's friends, Margaret Gatty, in Aunt Judy's magazine. Now, Margaret Gatty is exactly the author of one of those types of natural history books that Carroll would have preferred, and of which he, in fact, had a very large collection. She's the author of Parables in Nature, which also contains a conspicuous story about a very obnoxious caterpillar 10 years before he puts together his take on a very obnoxious caterpillar in Alice's Adventures in Wonderland. And I'm happy to talk about this more if you have any questions, as I've written about this elsewhere. But I would like to pause a little bit and think about the phrase parables and nature, because this is in fact the phrase that offers an alternative way of thinking about the impact of Carroll's fiction in a world in which we once again face significant changes in the world around us that fall within the remit of science, and that a science that explores, explains, but also often unsettles, a setting in which it is stories, and surprisingly often Alice, that help us untangle, understand, and settle. Which is what brings me to my final part of this talk, as I'm sort of coming slowly towards the end of it. Alice is absolutely omnipresent in scientific culture, and that in itself is a really rather significant fact, because whether or not we agree with the reading of Carroll and his environmental concerns, it is certain that other authors of scientific literature, but also of scientifically orientated children's literature, but also scientists, hard, cold fact scientists, have turned to Alice in Wonderland when it came to voicing their ideas. This includes some of the most famous books of scientific writings. Rachel Carson, for instance, in Silent Spring, resorts to Through the Looking Glass and Looking Glass comparisons throughout her book to explain what is happening in the world she sees around her. For those of you not familiar with Rachel Carson, this is seen as a seminal book of the 1960s, 70s environmental movement, in which Rachel Carson exposed the use of pesticides in agriculture, or the widespread use of pesticides and its damaging impact in agriculture in 1960s America. But it is also in more recent children's literature that tries to make us think differently about the environment. M.G. Leonard's Beetle Boy, which only came out a few years ago, takes as it's a book in which children learn to communicate with insects, and through them learn what's going on in parts of the world that they do not usually pay attention to, learn about the significance of pollination and insects and all sorts of other fantastic things. But it all starts off by imitating the scene of Alice conversing with a caterpillar that gives us a model of how we could interact with nature in such a way that we can understand it differently. But, you know, while I've given you two books very much apart, 60, 70 years apart, Alice was in fact always there. She's not a phenomenon that comes and goes. From the very early days, Alice has led an afterlife in science in which she becomes again and again the actress that takes us by the hand to walk us through unsettling scenarios in the history of science and the history of all fields of science, be it ecology, be it quantum science, be it modern manifestations of concerns about ecology, such as climate change. And she does that through history. Two examples I've picked out here for you is illustrate particularly well that Alice does not only do this, cannot only fulfill this function in 1870s England, but also in 1980s Australia, and Alice through the rainforest land. Alice is taken on a journey by the white rabbit, but also a journey of conversing to new looking glass insects, becomes a looking glass insect herself, as you can see in these lovely illustrations, and thus learns to understand nature completely differently. It is again looking glass insects, which in 2012 introduce Alice to the changes of biodiversity of our century, of the 21st century, when the Tyndall butterfly and the white rabbit take her to introduce her to plastic pollution, to the rainforests being cut down, and all sorts of other things. It is Alice that can explain the complexities of climate science, which sounds puzzling and confusing, such as Wonderland itself. But as we have learned to trust Alice on her journeys into whatever crazy wonderland she enters, we have also learned to trust her to guide us through it, interpret it for us, ask the right questions for us, and bring lessons back from us and land us as we land safely back in our own world. Alice has been there right from the start. She has populated scientific parody from almost the time of Alice in Wonderland in its appearance itself. as we can see down the microscope and what Alice found there, one of the early parodies of Alice in Science Land. We found Alice in Robert Gilmore's Alice in Quantum Land, in which Alice comes to be the one interpreting for us and to us the complexities and weirdnesses of quantum science. And it's almost uncanny how all of the Wonderland characters that seem to make no sense in the original Carroll story don't make sense, but perfectly make sense in interacting with Alice, who asks all the questions and reveals the perhaps perplexing but real answers to us about this crazy world. So much is Alice the language of quantum science that even some of the quantum science phenomena, such as the quantum Cheshire cat, a neutron that is split from its magnetic field, but sort of leaves remnants behind, like the cat that leaves behind its grin when it disappears, has been named the quantum Cheshire cat. So Alice navigates perhaps the most outrageous and discombobulating phenomena of science for us, whether it's the Red Queen effect in evolutionary science or medicine's puzzling Alice in Wonderland syndrome. Alice has guided us through space, where Alice in Wonderland meets Einstein, as NASA in fact phrased it when the Cheshire cat shaped galaxy appeared on one of its telescopes. But Alice is also the one who guides us through AI, one of the first AIs developed by Mark Zuckerberg. The first texts he exposed to it was Alice in Wonderland. And all the confusions around AI in modern discourse are so often linked to Alice in Wonderland. But that's really not surprising, because the first time we thought of chatbots and had to give them a name, one of the first among them was in fact called Alice, which stands for Artificial Linguistic Internet Computing Engine. And you can see a slightly Carrollian conversation with one of them right here. Now that I'm really at the end of my talk, I always like to end with this quote, because it really sums up what Alice can do in relation, well, to what it does in literature, but also a quote that's particularly pertinent when it comes to the interpretation of science and the cultural role of science and scientific phenomena and scientific discourse in our time and in Carroll's time. The fact that Lewis Carroll's first version of Alice's Adventures in Wonderland was called Alice's Adventures Underground is perhaps surprisingly prophetic. Perhaps even the final version would be more appropriately entitled Alice's Adventures Underground, since above else it embodies a comic horror vision of the chaotic land beneath the man-made groundwork of Western thought and convention, of which science and scientific culture and all of the scientific social upheaval it brings, all of the question unsettlement, that is very much part of our culture, of which we sometimes don't really see science a part of, but separate from, as my introduction through the little library record of Alan Turing tried to illustrate. They are in fact not so much different from one another. And Alice has consistently acted as a bridge from one to the other. And Alice, I don't think, will disappear from it, as her text, as we have seen, and her narrative patterns have served so much to connect us to the worlds that seem hard to understand, unsettling. She can guide us through them, give us comfort, give us orientation, and thus I think many of us will continue to be drawn to Alice in Wonderland to make sense of those things in science that might otherwise scare or confuse us. The end. This is just some acknowledgements for those of you who have made this presentation and this research possible. So I'll just leave that here for a second.
Thank you so much. And thank you for that forceful the end. As your host, I appreciate that when people just kind of peter out and you don't know what's happening. Fabulous. Fran, so many amazing, fresh new ideas in this presentation. We've got some great audience questions here. I have to admit, I'm just still stuck on the asylum balls. I was ignorant of this. I had never heard of this. So the general public would get tickets to go hang out with lunatics in the asylum, and it would just make them feel a lot better about themselves that they're not there.
Yes,
oh my gosh.
And I think this is interesting, because that is usually the part of my presentation that really gets people go like, oh my God, really? But if we think about it a little bit more, obsession with celebrity culture and their nervous breakdowns still really attracts our attention. We're still really obsessed with watching that sort of stuff as a society. So, you know, sort of ogling at people we consider have gone off rails is still something that's quite similar to our own culture, like our obsession with reality TV perhaps also. But one of the things that is really quite remarkable is the fact that these were working class asylums. Upper class people went to different types of asylums. So the reason quite a lot of working class people were in these asylums was that there was no equal density to the present, compared to the present day, of ordinary hospitals. That these lunatic asylums were built was very much to accommodate the pauper lunatic, the lunatic that didn't have any other money. Which is the working class lunatic. And a lot of these people were shoved in there because they were hallucinating, they were, you know, not making sense anymore, which in many cases was just manifestations of lung cancer and tuberculosis and things like that, which made you hallucinate, because these people were working in absolutely unethical conditions in factories that didn't have ventilation and all sorts of other things. This was the time of the cholera outbreaks, where people were really not well, and they were just being all shoved into these asylums. And you know, at this time we thought, you know, maybe it might actually be a good idea to not chain them up anymore, but actually be nice to them. And people were like amazed at how well this worked, and they're like, oh wow, we're not chaining them to walls anymore, and suddenly they're recovering. Oh wow, who could have thought? And it was really quite remarkable reading this research, because you know, you're really quite overwhelmed with how many people there were, and how vast these changes were, and that somebody would choose to go there and say, oh, isn't this nice that I'm not one of them? And you'd sort of see the face of madness, and they would actually also photograph patients on their journey out of madness and then confront them with how mad they looked just 2 months ago. So this is an age of, you know, phrenology, physiognomy, where we really believe that physical features could tell us something about the moral character of a human being. So this is all quite unsettling, but you know, the moment you realize we're not entirely over these tendencies yet, Alice can still make us think twice.
Yes. Yeah, you can go ahead and stop sharing your screen. And yes, thank you, because my next question was, you know, who are these lunatics? Because I'm guessing a lot of them were not lunatics in the least, which you just answered. So we've got, oh, before we get to our questions, I wanted to drop in the chat there. There is a social hour immediately following our Q&A here that's at a different link, a Zoom meeting, so everyone may talk and be seen and heard. And so if you want to open that in another window or whatever, and it was also in the email that went out this morning, the social hour link, for those of you on our email list. So be sure to join us there. And Fran, will you be able to join us for some of the social hour?
Hopefully.
Wonderful. All right. And you know, we have some great questions, but as always, you also learn from our chat if you take a look at those. Your former,
I have not looked at the chat.
Oh well, you were quite busy. Yeah, don't worry about it. But your former student Cindy Water mentioned that someone called Rachel
Hello,
Carson's
Cindy.
discursive prose Jabberwockian, which I thought was fascinating. Somebody asked if the fallacies on vivisection wasn't that a forgery, and someone else answered that the pamphlet was a forgery, but the contents within it were not. So we learned something there. And let's go to our questions. Kirk Davis thanks you for a fabulous lecture, and he's wondering, you lecture about religion as well. Which do you think influenced Lewis's prose more, his religion or his mathematics?
Oh, this is absolutely this is a great question. And the reason I usually bring up this, so I'll take a couple of steps back. The reason I usually bring up the natural history books is that it's, again, one of those things that I mention in my lectures. When I say that, you know, natural history was written to discover God in nature and God's truth in nature. And people usually take a step back, but isn't the 1860s, you know, like the age of Darwin, where everybody stopped believing in religion? But this is completely not what happened. Most of the science books in this age, and actually probably till very late in the 19th century, were published by churches or by religious movements. They produced enormous amounts of these books. in order to offer their own teachings on nature. So science and religion were really quite closely intertwined, and that also applied to mathematics. The way you can sort of most easily understand this, so when we look at education at university settings in England in particular, for instance, we've got two main universities in the 19th century, Oxford and Cambridge. UCL is just being sort of in the process of being set up in the early 19th century as an alternative to them. Reasons for which will become obvious in a second. But if we look at Oxford and the way it taught maths, there were two professorial chairs in mathematics at the time, the so-called civilian chairs in mathematics. They were in geometry and in astronomy. Those were the two disciplines believed to be able to measure God's creation, the heavens and on earth. There's a very, very religious foundation for those two lectureships in mathematics. Now, obviously, things changed throughout the 19th century. There were way more people coming to university eventually, including women. So we had more teaching staff and so on. But the foundation of Oxford, for instance, was that mathematics was fundamentally entwined with religion, because it sought truth, and that especially also applied to the other discipline kindred with mathematics, really, which is logic, which through the same sort of mathematical reasoning, but applied to language, tried to discern truth, which was a fundamentally religious concern, because God was the ultimate truth, his creation was truth. And for someone who is so religious as Carroll, this was absolutely integral in understanding him as a mathematician. As I mentioned very briefly, he saw mathematics as the work that he did for God. Two sort of pieces of reading I'd like to point out for that, if you're interested in reading more on that, is Charlie Lovett's recent Formed by Faith, where he talks a little bit about Lewis Carroll's upbringing, the role of mathematics and religion in it, but also Work for God, Mark Richards' essay in Mathematicians and Their Gods, which came out with Oxford University Press a few years ago, both of which reflect on how Carroll understood his talent in mathematics as his gift from God, and therefore all of his pursuit of mathematics would be, as he himself said, his work for God. So in a way, it's sort of impossible to say which one influenced him more, because to him they were the same thing.
That is a great answer. Someone asked in the chat, will this be available later on? And it will be on our YouTube channel. And Fran, I'm not sure if you saw, we had a professor of religious studies, Dr. Ryan Armstrong, did our January and February events, a double feature. And he brings just the same energy and the same kind of new thinking that you do. I actually said to someone recently, I think a great event would be to get Dr. Kohlt and Dr. Armstrong in the same room and just turn on the camera and let it go and just see what comes out.
Absolutely, in for that.
It'd be amazing.
I mean, if I could drop a sort of slightly sneaky piece of advertising, I did a similar conversation on George MacDonald last year, I think, on George MacDonald's Science and Religion, and how, of course, because George MacDonald was a great friend of Lewis Carroll's, and their literary writing is also so complementary in the way in which they treat science and religion and literature as an expression, a sort of navigation, like sort of a process of navigating the tensions and the social tensions around them, the personal tensions they experience. And it just gives the whole thing so much complexity, and letting these two authors speak to one another through these conversations was also just absolutely delightful. So that's also online, and you can find it on the channel of the George MacDonald Society.
Wonderful. No, I think that's a very appropriate plug. Thank you. Brian Sibley has a question. Do you think that Dodgson's interest in educational exploration might have been piqued by his friendship with Charles Kingsley, whose Glaucus, or the Wonders of the Shore, which had been published in 1855 and which focused on sea life, just as other books had chosen insects for the subject?
Yeah, great question, Brian. I would have expected no less. But yeah, I could have talked endlessly about Kingsley and Carroll. Oh wait, I have written a PhD thesis on them. So I'll try to keep this to not thesis length, but sort of Q&A length. Glaucus and the Wonders of the Shore is a fantastic place to start this conversation, actually, because we talked about Alexander Macmillan, he was not only the publisher of Lewis Carroll, but also of Charles Kingsley. And that's kind of important because the Macmillan brothers are, they used to be publishers based in Cambridge, primarily of mathematical tracts for teaching. And it's really interesting because Alexander Macmillan said something really clever, that mathematics was his way of sort of ordering the perceived chaos of creation and bringing it into the order in which God intended it. So that was sort of, as a publisher, he felt like he had to do a really good job as a publisher to do the work of God justice. Now that becomes important because they didn't publish fiction until they met Charles Kingsley, who was at the time a Regius Professor of Modern History at the University of Cambridge, but also a canon later on of Westminster Abbey, obviously a religious man all his life, but also a defender of Darwin later on. And he was the one who convinced the Macmillan brothers to publish fiction, first his own, but then later, as we know, also the works of Lewis Carroll and many others. Kingsley was really involved in the publication of Alice in Wonderland, so he actually counter-read Alice before it was published. They also met previously. They were introduced as the sort of people like, you know, oh, Kingsley published a fairy tale with them, so maybe you should actually go to Macmillan. So there's lots of sort of entanglement. He did really like Kingsley. He had quite a lot of Kingsley's books, and Kingsley explored the seashore as a place in which you could find God's wonders. But it is really interesting when you read Glaucus. It's a sort of stroll along the seashore, and he points out like various bits and pieces to use that you find at the seashore, various creatures, and then he goes on he goes off script, and he goes like, oh yeah, but some of us tell us there's no evolution in this, like how can they say this? And then he goes sort of negotiating, like, you know, you believe this doesn't happen, would you distrust God's creation, and so on. So while this seems like a really unpolitical thing to write about, it is actually really quite loaded. There's quite a lot of richness in it, and that sort of natural history writing pops up in many of the not explicitly natural history writings, such as the Water Babies, but also Alton Locke. And I think if I were to give an answer directly to Brian's question, I think maybe it wasn't Glaucus that kicked him off that, but actually Alton Locke. Alton Locke, its subtitle is Poet and Tailor, is a Chartist novel, and it's all about Chartism, and the suffering of workers during the cholera epidemics. But there's a really weird dream sequence in it, which is basically the forerunner of the Water Babies. And this is the one that completely morally transforms the person who has the dream, but also exposes the immorality of everyone else, after which Alton Locke then eventually dies. And it's completely the forerunner of the Water Babies. But we know that Carroll really loved the book because he actually writes a diary entry on it twice. And I think it's in Kingsley's conflation of the political, the satirical, the sort of dual audience of children and adults, because the Water Babies was first actually published in Macmillan's magazine for adults as a sort of satirical piece that used the fairy tale as a satirical medium, but then rewritten as a fairy tale for children and published as an actual book rather than a series. So I think Kingsley definitely played a huge role in sort of taking Carroll's imagination places where that could be possible. But it is also that Macmillan really, really quite strongly models the publication of Alice in Wonderland in practical terms on the publication of the Water Babies. So there's so much in there. I could give another talk on that.
We'll schedule it for next month. We're all set. All right, so we have time for a few more questions here. Kelly in San Francisco. That's a rather loaded question, a subjective question. Any idea as to whether Carroll selected a caterpillar over other insects to embody human obnoxiousness?
Oh, great. Yes, I can actually give you a really, really good answer to that, because I talked about not Gaskell, Gatty. We'll talk about Gaskell later. But Margaret Gatty actually the first story in Margaret Gatty's Parables from Nature is really poignant because it's got a really obnoxious caterpillar in it. And obnoxious caterpillars were absolutely everywhere in Victorian children's literature, and not just in Victorian children's literature, because they are immature if you think about it. So the life cycle of an insect, especially of a butterfly, is they start off as an egg, generally, then turn into a caterpillar. And caterpillars, if you think about them in anthropomorphic terms, are not very social animals. They eat absolutely everything. They do not care about your nice flowers. They especially don't care about your nice fruit and vegetables and your lovingly curated little windowsill garden. They will just eat everything, which seems quite obnoxious. But if we then take ourselves back a little bit to Gatty's stories, it becomes evident of why they are such popular characters in children's literature. Because that caterpillar is particularly obnoxious because it starts lecturing a bird when it sees a butterfly that, we're definitely not the same species. Are you blind or stupid? Like, it's got wings. Do I look like I've got wings? Right. And of course, then it goes off, turns into a chrysalis, and then emerges as a butterfly and becomes really humble and goes like, oh yeah, they were actually right. Well, maybe next time I transform, I will really trust the process. And it's really interesting. If you then go back to Carroll's caterpillar, that's of course exactly what goes on, because Carroll is absolutely relentless in that scene. They are both children. Alice is a child and the caterpillar is also a child. They are both exactly 3 inches high. He literally goes on about how the same they are. The only thing that elevates the caterpillar is a mushroom, and a mushroom is a parasite. And it's really interesting when he parodies the whole sort of poem about the busy bee, which becomes a crocodile. It turns into a predator. So something about predation and parasitism is definitely in there. But this caterpillar is obnoxious. It's exactly the same thing. It lectures Alice. It asks Alice to recite her poetry, to sort of regurgitate the things he learned by heart. There's Carroll's educational criticism again, because that's not the way in which Carroll wants to learn anything. And of course, the caterpillar is just obnoxious. It's awful. And then it disappears because, of course, it needs to disappear. It needs to change. So the caterpillar is like always been a symbol for transformation, for metamorphosis, immaturity to maturity. And in a lot of religious texts, actually, the caterpillar or of the moth or the butterfly are really potent symbols. And for exactly that reason, because we should trust this process as a human, they become metaphors for the spiritual transformation of the human, which of course can be applied to all sorts of scenarios, but in religious settings and mythological settings, it's often the soul, the sort of transcendence of the human imperfection that is embodied in our earthly life, to the butterfly, which is of course the soul, perfect and everything. And it's really interesting that this still actually sticks in our language. When you look at the Greek name for butterfly, which is used in scientific language still, it's psyche, as in psyche, the psyche as in psychology. And the mature insect is still an imago, as the imagination. It's really interesting how that sort of language still plays with us. And there's a reason I'm so obsessed with insects, because they're just so full of symbolism. There we are.
Amazing. Ruth Berman at exactly the same time you mentioned psyche wrote that in the chat. Great psyche means both soul and butterfly. Great minds.
Yes.
And I absolutely love when I've read a book 100 billion times approximately, and then someone says something that just, wait a minute, makes you realize maybe not that you were thinking about it wrong. You know, we all have interpretations, but I've just always, maybe because he's doing an adult activity, he's smoking, or maybe because he just is in control of the conversation more than Alice is. I've always considered the caterpillar to be like an adult, but of course he's literally immature because he's a caterpillar, not a butterfly. And also, yeah, everything he's saying is very, I know you are, but what am I kind of thing. You know, he's not, they are both children.
It's so interesting that you mentioned the smoking, actually, because of course that's something that we consider an adult activity, and not that I'm at any point going to suggest that it is or wasn't not an adult activity. But if we look at Tenniel's illustrations of water pipes, like the sort of hookah that he illustrates in those stories, he illustrates that in his satirical career quite a few times. So he does some, you know, nowadays perhaps, you know, from a modern perspective, slightly questionable portrayals of Turks in his political caricatures, and they're very often just portrayed with a sort of pipe. When he portrays a pipe dream as sort of a mad thing that's being dreamt up, he illustrates hookahs quite a few times. But we can also see that he illustrates politicians that behave like babies in his which we know that we won't struggle to find modern equivalents of politicians that behave like babies, so just imagine one of them and Tenniel illustrating them as a baby. But then he needs to find an equivalent of a hookah that he can give to a baby. And now if you Google, and you can do this live if you don't believe me, baby feeding bottles, Victorian baby feeding bottles, if you want to Google that right now, because few of you are going to Google and then they're going to go like, what? They look like hookahs. I am not joking.
Amazing.
So this if you want to quote me on that, it's in my PhD. I've put all of Tenniel's illustrations right next to one another. And if you just slightly shrink a hookah, because they had like a straw, which they now don't have, but they were basically sort of blobby glass bottles with a straw in them, so they did actually kind of look like a hookah. So it's actually, to Victorian audience, this would have been a lot more ambiguous visually than it would have been to us.
Wow, that's very enlightening. Wow. And how many of you Googled it, I wondered. So we're going to do one more question. I'm sorry, we're not going to get to everybody, but do come to the social hour, because that does often turn into an extended Q&A. But we do have a question that relates to something someone asked in the chat as well. Someone in the chat asked if you have a suggested reading list for the many things you talked about today. So if you'd want to send something like that to me, I can post it on all our social media for everybody. And also Joshua Blogett, in a related question, asked, do you have a favorite Carrollian related scientific publication? His is An Approach Through the Looking Glass by Dr. Hirschberger, who essentially taught baby chickens to walk away from a food dish in order to reach a food dish.
Great, I love that. I'm going to look this up right away. Do I have a favorite science publication related to Carroll? That is one of those questions that I would like to give a 16-page long answer to. I think my favorite scientific text by Carroll is actually Hiawatha's Photographing, and in relation to that, Photography Extraordinary, because that's a slightly earlier text where Carroll muses satirically on what would happen if we could apply photographic processes to the mind. So that might not be specifically what you're thinking about, but I think that is, the most revealing sort of way in which Carroll understood the scientific functions of these things in relation to Carroll. As I said, this will all be coming out as a book next year, Alice Through the Wonderglass. And in the meantime, you can read quite a lot about this sort of stuff in my PhD thesis, which is also eventually going to come out as a book, but it's going to take a little bit longer because academic presses are very, very slow. And I've also written articles about the insect thing and the madness and lunatic asylum thing. And there's also, and I think this is particularly interesting, I like sort of radio programs and podcasts, and there are two, one on moths and one on mirrors that I've done recently, where I talk about that in the insect transformation in that context, and the function of a mirror psychologically in the history of science and the history of psychology, and where Alice sits within that. So those you can also read up on as the sort of things that I've mentioned, and there's quite a lot of that in there. And if you really, really do want the 30-page long version of that reading list, my PhD thesis has a bibliography which is super long and has an appendix with surprising things such as the baby feeding bottles, and also the surprising relevance of Victorian bathing suits in the water babies. That is an actual page of my PhD appendix, and I swear it is actually relevant.
Oh, I believe you. I believe you. So everyone, I'm going to drop, once again, that email with the link to the social hour. And Dr. Franziska Kohlt, thank you so much. You've given us all so much to think about today. This was just a wonderful presentation. Everybody, there is an in-person conference coming up in September. very end of September, September 29th to October 1st in Cleveland at Case Western Reserve University. So if you have not registered for that, please do so if you can get yourself to Cleveland. And I know, these are frugal times. Maybe you're thinking, I can't go to Cleveland just for a Lewis Carroll Society of North America meeting. Well, guess what? Our PDF has all the amazing other things you can do in Cleveland. Of course, the world famous Rock and Roll Hall of Fame that most of you know about, but a whole bunch of other things too. So be sure to go to our website, lewiscarroll.org/events, and check out that program, because Arnold Hirschon did an amazing job just showing you all the other things you'll be able to do in Cleveland besides our wonderful 3-day event. And Fran, thank you so much once again. And we will see you in just a minute at Social Hour. All right. Thanks, everybody.